In our last episode, we dealt with what was probably the lowest point in South African history in the 20th century. It was the Rubicon speech, the collapse of international confidence in South Africa, the value of the rand dropping through the floor, the threat of banks to stop lending us money, to stop rolling over our short-term debt. The country was in crisis. And then things started to change. In 1986, the state of emergency started to have an effect. South Africa was still isolated. In 1987, there was an election in which the National Party won once again, but with a reduced majority. Can you tell us about that election?
Well, it was fought on a verligte platform. It was fought on a reformist platform, saying there's a need for reform. Give us a mandate to reform. And it went very well. Notwithstanding my image as a very conservative member of the leadership of the National Party, some newspapers wrote after that election campaign that I was going the furthest in spelling out the logical consequences, and that I actually played a very verligte role in that election campaign. It was a good campaign. We expected to have a reduced majority. The Conservative Party was quite strong at that stage, attracted a lot of votes, but we won, and we had a sort of a reformist mandate. And on the basis of that, we could proceed. But unfortunately, it appeared as if Mr. Botha has lost his taste for the further reform. Yes, there were reforms on the legal side. Certain of the most obnoxious apartheid legislation was repealed. But he was treading water on the issue of black political rights.
Most of the developments, in fact, now began to take place elsewhere in Southern Africa on the border between Angola and Namibia. The Soviet Union had invested a great deal of money and effort into expanding its influence in Southern Africa. There was a deployment of up to 50,000 Cuban troops in Angola. And in 1987, with the Soviet Union's blessing, the Angolan government decided to launch a major offensive involving more than 50,000 troops to move into the southeastern corner of Angola and capture Jonas Savimbi's capital and to knock UNITA out of the war. And as a result of this, a battle took place on the Lomba River in October 1987, which turned out to be a crushing defeat for the MPLA, the Angolans, the Cubans, under Soviet leadership. In the ensuing battles, South Africa destroyed over 120 Soviet tanks. A whole MPLA brigade was destroyed at the Battle of the Lomba River. The Angolans fell back on Cuita-Cuanavalle. South African forces never tried to take Cuita-Cuanavalle, but this changed the geostrategic situation because it was at that point that Gorbachev, who was more interested in perestroika and glasnost, instructed the Cubans and the Angolans to make peace, reach an agreement with South Africa. And the idea was that this agreement would lead to the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola, and at the same time the UN independence plan for Namibia would be implemented. Now, this had very, very far-reaching implications for the situation in the whole of South Africa, because the principal strategic concern of South Africa during this period was the growing Soviet influence in our part of the world. And this meant that that influence would go. So what was the impact of this on the cabinet? How did the National Party view this? Did it see this as an opportunity? And how did it view then the imminent independence process in Namibia? What impact would that have on South Africa?
Well, of course there was great joy because of our victory at the Battle of Lomba. And it opened the door for further constructive actions and developments. The National Party was sick and tired of the problem of the old Southwest Africa. It wanted a solution there. The withdrawal of the Cuban troops was a victory. The door was beginning to open because of Gorbachev's obsession with perestroika and the good things he was doing for Russia at that stage. So we saw a window of opportunity and we used it. And the result was settlement of the situation in Namibia, a new constitution being drawn up, Namibia being granted independence in the end. I attended the independence functions. And when the South African flag was lowered and the Namibian flag was raised, I was already president then. But this process convinced, I think, many South Africans that yes, the right way forward is negotiations, is a new constitutional dispensation. So what happened in Namibia laid the foundation for what later happened in South Africa. And it built confidence in processes aimed at ending decades and century-old conflicts.
Yeah, the Namibian issue, the question of Namibia, Southwest Africa, had been one of the two major obstacles in South Africa's relationship with the international community. Yeah. And that was resolved. But what would have happened if things had gone wrong in Namibia? If it hadn't led to a peaceful settlement and to the emergence of a democratic constitution?
Well, that's a question of speculation. But I would speculate it would have strengthened the hands of those who were against major reforms. We would have swung to the right. We would have become more internal looking instead of seeing ourselves as part of the international community where we must restore our relationships. It would lead to further isolation and it would have been very bad. So it was good for the South African process that the Namibian process worked reasonably well.
But of course, the other great problem that South Africa had with the international community was the whole question of apartheid and the rights of black South Africans. Now, in 1986, the Commonwealth took an initiative, the Eminent Persons Group. They sent eminent former leaders from the Commonwealth, Malcolm Fraser and others, Obasanjo from Nigeria, to South Africa to see if they could broker some kind of deal between the National Party government and forces, other forces in the country wanting radical reform. During one of these EPG meetings, South Africa unleashed attacks on Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, 3 Commonwealth countries. What on earth was the cabinet thinking about? Did the cabinet know about this? Or what was going on? And what messages was PW Botha trying to send the world?
No, the cabinet was not involved. It wasn't the cabinet decision to launch those attacks. Those attacks were planned and part of the strategy, I believe, of PW Botha. He didn't treat that EPG group very well. He also didn't have good discussions with them. He regarded them as interfering in our internal affairs. He was quite vicious. I've heard later from people who attended some of the meetings. I was not part of any of those meetings, so I was not in the inner circle, and I don't have first-hand experience of it. But yes, it seems as if those attacks were planned to coincide with this visit, to send a message that we will defend ourselves against terrorism, as it was called, and that we will not allow ourselves to be pressured into negotiations with terrorists, because that was the stance at that stage.
Now, it was also at this time, I think, that Nelson Mandela began to realize that there wouldn't be a revolutionary victory. I think he began to realize from his prison cell in Pollsmoor that continued revolutionary struggle and repression would just leave the country in ruins. And he opened a channel of communication to the P.W. Botha government through, I think, the minister involved with correctional services, Kobie Coetzee, and a whole series of talks began between the P.W. Botha government and South Africans. Neil Barnard of the National Intelligence Service, Kobie Coetzee. Was the cabinet aware of these developments?
The cabinet was not aware. It was on a need-to-know basis. The four most important people in those discussions were Kobie Coetzee, were Mr. van der Merwe, the Secretary, Director General of Justice, General Willemse, the head of Correctional Services, and Neil Barnard, the head of National Intelligence. And they prepared the ground with Mandela for the possibility. It was talks about talks. They didn't discuss the real issues. They didn't discuss constitutional reform. They discussed the need for negotiation. When I became the leader of the National Party, on the 2nd of February 1989, but PW stayed on as president, I became the president-elect in a certain sense of the word. And Kobie Coetzee then arranged for me a full briefing of the discussions with Mandela. And since that time, until I became president in September 89, I was briefed about discussions with him and with elements in Europe representing the ANC and such activities. It was all talks about talks. No agreements were reached. Mandela was even allowed to write a letter to Oliver Tambo and to his National Executive Committee of the ANC to get a mandate to carry on with these talks about talks, and he did get the mandate. But all this was, the knowledge of all this was limited to a very small circle.
So during this period, some of the robots, some of the traffic lights for constitutional negotiations started to turn green. The South African government and the ANC had reached the conclusion that there would not be an armed solution to South Africa's problems.
True.
The Soviet Union, after the Tripartite Agreement between Cuba, Angola, and South Africa in 1988, was clearly no longer interested in projecting its power in South Africa. Southern Africa. And this had huge implications because it meant that the main support for the South African Communist Party within the ANC alliance was beginning to wither. So that was another green traffic light. But one of the main obstacles still remained P.W. Botha's attitude to fundamental reform. He wasn't prepared to concede that a white-controlled South African government would no longer exist in a new dispensation. What was your reading of P.W. Botha's ability to cross the Rubicon, actually? And what was your personal relationship with him like?
P.W., after this, from 87, started treading water. He was no longer pushing for reform. He was no longer open to real debate about this. He was, as you've said, strong on maintaining, in a sense, white rule. He didn't call it that, but on maintaining the position that the whites will have the final say in South Africa. He wasn't opening himself up in any way to real give and take negotiations, which would end up where we did end up. So he became a stumbling block to a certain extent. Everything came to a standstill, and we needed to move forward. When I was elected on the 2nd of February 89 as leader of the National Party, in the National Party caucus, I made a short speech. And I said, the time for a quantum leap has come. And somebody in the audience said, jump, FW, jump.
Well,
that was the spirit in the National Party. But he was smothering it.
And there were other factors that were contributing to a climate for change. All of this time, South Africa had been developing despite sanctions, despite economic restrictions and so forth. More and more black South Africans were moving into the cities, becoming involved in the economy at higher and higher levels. And one of the areas where there was the most important change actually was in the area of education. You were the Minister of National Education. But between 1980 and 1994, there was a revolution in secondary and tertiary education for black South Africans. In 1980, only 15,000 black kids passed matric, compared with 49,000 whites. By 1994, more than 200,000 black kids were passing matric, compared with only 60,000 whites. So a revolution had taken place. By 1994, there were more black, colored, and Indian kids at university than whites. And these underlying factors also led to change. What was your experience of that, and what about the role that you played at this time as Minister of National Education?
Well, education used to be on the basis of race. There were black schools, and there were brown schools, and there were Indian schools, and there were white schools. And not to the same extent, it applied also to universities. When I became Minister of National Education, I was presented by my department with the challenge that we must equalize the money invested in the education of South African kids and de-racialize it. The whites were getting much more per child than any of the other groups. Then the Indians came. They were second. Then the brown people came, and then last was the blacks. And they developed a formula how we could, in 10 or 12 or 15 years, take away from the whites, cut the fat, allocate it to black education, to colored education, and to achieve very good high standards on the basis of spending the same amount per capita per kid, irrespective of race or color. And that was the challenge that I accepted when I became Minister of National Education. And we were working on this formula. And we were implementing this formula. But when 1994 came, the ANC started, they must re-invite the wheel. Instead of carrying on with this formula, then we would have stood much further if they did with education in South Africa, which at the moment is a catastrophe. So, education then lied at the heart of the challenge, as it does today.
In this episode, we've dealt with the factors that opened the way to fundamental transformation in South Africa, taking us right up to the beginning of 1989. In our next episode, we will look at the tumultuous developments during 1989, the election of FW de Klerk as leader of the National Party, and his election as president in September 1989, and the beginning of the transformation process.